Welcome to the 12th Annual Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies Senior Thesis Research Forum. The purpose of this forum is to showcase outstanding policy-related research in the Department of Economics by matriculating seniors from Princeton University. I'd like to thank all of our seniors for their hard work on putting together their presentations that you'll see here. And I'd also like to congratulate them on winning the 2023 Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies Senior Thesis Prize. Our presenters this year include Melina Huang. Melina's thesis explores the effects of commercial to residential adaptive reuse on nearby housing prices. Melina's thesis advisor is Jacob Bastian. Faith Moore. Faith's thesis focuses on the impact of the El Nino Southern Oscillation on U.S. and European renewable energy stock markets. Faith's thesis advisor is Lynn Pang. Georgia Nabors. Georgia's thesis analyzes the effects of privately provided low-income housing on neighborhood composition, and Georgia's thesis advisor is also Jacob Bastian. Jean Suttasunthorn. Jean's thesis investigates the impact of migrant enclaves on labor market integration using evidence from refugees in Germany. Jean's thesis advisor is Lynn To. And Sean Wang. Sean's thesis examines the effects of the removal of the exclusion of biosimilars from Medicare's coverage gap discount program. And Sean's thesis advisor is Kate Ho. Again, thank you for tuning in for this virtual forum and for your support of undergraduate research.
Hi everyone, my name is Melina Huang, and I'll be presenting on my thesis titled Old Buildings, New Ideas, which explores the effects of commercial to residential adaptive reuse on nearby housing prices in the US. And before I start, I just wanted to thank my advisor, Jacob Bastian, for being such a wonderful mentor throughout this entire process. So adaptive reuse is the process of converting a building's use type from one to another. So anything from a vacant office building or an unused old industrial warehouse into a brand new apartment complex. So with adaptive reuse, you're adding new housing stock, which would theoretically decrease prices, but you're also renewing older buildings and increasing the attractiveness of the neighborhood, which would theoretically increase prices. So there's kind of this opposing mechanism at play here. And I'm interested in this notion of replacing an urban disamenity with an amenity and seeing how that contributes to different price effects of neighboring houses. In addition to this, I also look at the potential heterogeneity that exists for ARPs that are purely market rate and those that include some level of affordable housing units. I also look at how different original use types of these buildings, such as office or industrial or hotel, can also influence price effects. My method is centered around this variation in proximity design, where I look at a 0.5 mile radius of each ARP and designate certain properties as treatment and control based on their distance to the ARP. So anything within 3 or 0.3 miles of the ARP is designated as treatment, and any properties located within 0.3 to 0.5 miles is designated as a controlled property. And my dataset includes 184 ARPs in 25 different cities in 19 US states. And my housing price data comes from Zillow, which I scraped and obtained about 100,000 unique properties. This includes both rental and sales data points. My methods also included a series of staggered difference in difference models, and I first looked at distance and time, so a property's price and how it depends on the distance from an ARP and how many years out since the conversion happened. So I normalize all of the conversion years into event years. So I look at 6 years prior to the conversion and 6 years after the conversion. And my secondary model looks at distance, but also the number of units in an ARP. And I break this down into a couple different categories and look at differences of prices based on the size of the ARP from small, medium, large to extra large. This slide breaks down the main effects of my baseline model. And here you can see that my hypothesis does ring true with the main effects that I found. So holding time constant, the prices of properties located closest to the ARP or those in ring 1 have the greatest price difference compared to the other rings and the control ring. So from 9 to 3 to 2%. And then in terms of the main effects for the event year, you can see here that as you get farther out from the conversion year, which is event year 0, the price increase is significantly greater as you move out. And it's interesting to note that the rentals are a bit subdued compared to the owned properties, which are much more sensitive to price effects. While the distance and time main effects do follow my hypothesis, what's more important to consider in terms of trend effects is the interaction between distance and time. And this slide summarizes the results that I found. So those top 3 represent the price effects for owned properties, and the bottom effect, or the bottom summarizes the effects for rental properties. And so here it's a bit murkier. The effects aren't as clear just from the fact that the coefficients are not significant. The majority of them are not significant. And so even though there's a general positive effect over time and space, I cannot conclude that there's a significant difference in prices between treatment rings over time, or in other words, that there is a trend effect between different rings. I also ran this model on a more collapsed scale, meaning I pulled together event years to produce a more binary and higher level view of the effects at hand. And here you can see that the distance main effects were also consistent with the original version of this model, where with with closer proximity, the effect on price is greater. And as you move away from the ARP, the positive effect decreases. There was also a positive effect for the binary indicator, indicating that whether the event year was after the conversion. Here, these 2 variables were significant, but the overall aggregate effect, if you added everything up, was so marginal that I could not conclude that even with this collapsed binary version, that there was a significant difference between properties in different distance rings, or that there was a trend effect. But given that there is a very consistent and significant pattern of distance and time main effects, this does suggest that the conversion acted as an addition of an urban amenity and potentially the removal of an urban disamenity. My secondary model looks at distance and the size of the ARP, or how many units are located in the ARP. Similarly to the last model, the distance main effects were also consistent in terms of my hypothesis, in that as you move away from the ARP, the positive effect decreases relative to the control ring. Additionally, my hypothesis about the size and the effect of the size on price was also right. As you can see here, that the bigger the size of the ARP, the bigger the price effect on the neighboring housing. So as you increase in size, this is all relative to the smallest size of ARP, which is omitted here, but you move up from 7 to 10 to 17%. So the main effects do show a pattern that is significant, but like the last model, the interaction effects here are not as easily deciphered. None of these, except for one, are significant, and so it's unclear whether or not a significant effect of size on prices between properties in different distance rings exists. So price effects increases with ARP size, but only across the same distance ring and not across different distance rings, so not across ring 1, ring 2, and ring 3. I also wanted to touch on heterogeneity. As I mentioned earlier, I also looked at how the prices of properties located near market rate versus affordable housing ARPs differed. And what I found was that properties near market rate ARPs were much higher than those located near affordable housing ARPs, about a 20% difference. And then it gets more interesting when you look at whether or not low-income housing tax credits were used to construct the affordable housing ARP. And properties that were located near a LIHTC ARP were almost 50% less than those located near a non-LIHTC ARP. which is quite a significant difference. And so in terms of typologies, I looked at how original use types of the buildings, so healthcare, office, hotel, industrial, and other, differed in terms of producing different price effects. And I compared them to office, since office is the most commonly converted building type, and found that there was a significant difference in terms of original use type, where healthcare ranked first, industrial ranked last. And I think it's important to note here that the other category consists of a range of use types, from schools to churches to retail stores, which might be a source of this variation in numbers between owned and rental properties. So, in terms of policy implications, just to summarize my work here, um, my paper really focused on adaptive reuse as an urban renewal technique, and I wanted to ask, how do urban renewal techniques with intended positive externalities fare in the real world housing markets? And what I found was that there was a positive effect on housing prices for properties located closest to the ARPs. And so for homeowners, for property owners near ARPs, they would experience a positive effect. And prices are generally higher the closer they are to ARPs, but also with larger ARPs or more dense ARPs that have more units, there is also a bigger positive effect. The heterogeneity with the affordable housing units versus market rate housing was quite interesting too, but it's also important to note that I gave the title of affordable ARP to any ARP that had any level of affordable housing units. So anything that had anything between 1% of affordable housing units to 100% of affordable housing units was designated as affordable housing ARP. And so I think further studies would benefit from a bit more nuance in terms of defining what affordable ARP means. So in the age of a post-pandemic world where office vacancies have reached an abnormal high and the interest in adaptive reuse has skyrocketed, I think it's more important than ever for policymakers to re-examine and reevaluate the current very restrictive urban planning policies and regulations that prevent and discourage developers from pursuing adaptive reuse compared to traditional new construction projects. Given that there is a positive effect on the neighborhood in terms of property prices and market values, this is definitely an avenue to be explored with more research and more data collection. And the fact that many studies have shown that adaptive reuse, it could be a potential tool to address the sustainability crisis as well as the lack of affordable housing, just overall housing affordability uh, shortage. I think that adaptive reuse could be a potential technique and tool to help subdue this crisis currently. And so this is just a very general overview of my thesis, but thank you everyone for listening in, and thank you so much to the Griswold Center for giving me the chance to speak about this. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Faith and I'm from the UK. I just graduated from Princeton with an AB in economics and a certificate in environmental studies. I'm here today to give you a brief overview about my thesis, which was titled The Impact of the El Niño Southern Oscillation on US and European Renewable Energy Stock Markets. Before I go into it, I just wanted to say a massive thank you again to my advisor, Lin Peng, for all of her continuous support and advice. I never would have been able to do it without her, and I'm extremely grateful. So before I discuss what my thesis entails, I wanted to provide a little bit of context behind what the El Niño Southern Oscillation actually is. So it's a recurring climate pattern, often shortened and referred to as ENSO, which involves interactions between the central and eastern tropical Pacific and the overlying atmosphere. This makes it one of the most important climate phenomena on Earth, as the interactions alter weather everywhere, whether that be storms, droughts, floods, heat waves, etc. ENSO also has three states. There is El Nino, which is characterized by abnormally warm sea surface temperatures. There's La Nina, which is characterized by abnormally cold sea surface temperatures. And then there is the neutral phase. And this tends to be the stage when the climate is in transition between the cold and the warm phases of ENSO, meaning the sea surface temperature doesn't really vary much from the average. Though ENSO tends to be characterized by sea surface temperature in the eastern tropical Pacific, there are additional characteristics which accompany El Nino and La Nina events, such as the pressure system, precipitation, winds, etc. Another key characteristic of ENSO, which I allude to in my thesis, is that ENSO is a climate oscillation. This means it's periodic. The ENSO cycle operates over a timescale of approximately 2 to 7 years. This is actually quite important for climate finance, and I'll come back to that in a second when I discuss my contributions to the literature, but the periodicity of oscillations, as opposed to the chaos of weather, offers investors some degree of forecasting. So my thesis looks at the intersection between ENSO and renewable energy stock markets. Personally, I'm really interested in climate science, especially atmospheric and oceanic science, and so I wanted to incorporate this into my thesis in some kind of way. When I was thinking about topics, I kind of realized, one, renewable energy is often weather dependent, and two, ENSO, as it affects the global atmospheric circulation, is often described as a master weather maker. And so if you have something that is thought to control the weather to some degree, and something which is affected by weather, you'd expect there to be a relationship between the two, which is why I decided to test it. Also, when I was exploring into the climate finance literature, I saw that the effects of ENSO had started to be explored, but there was still a significant gap in the literature which I could contribute to. So now I'll go into a bit more detail about the existing literature around these topics. In terms of the climate science literature, there have been several studies which show that ENSO affects renewable energy. And so this connection is quite well established, at least from a climate science perspective. However, there have been far less studies in the economics and financial sphere. There has been some research into the effect of ENSO on the aggregate stock market, though a consensus is far from being reached. Now, if we go even more niche, before my paper, there had only been one study which looked at the intersection between renewable energy stocks and ENSO. This paper found that La Nina tends to have larger impact on returns than El Nino, and that the effect of ENSO differs depending on the state of the renewable energy market, i.e., whether the market is bullish or bearish. My thesis builds off all of this research and contributes to the climate finance literature in 4 key ways. Firstly, I extend the sample period to include up to the end of 2022, and this is about a 1.5 year extension on the previous study. Though this might not seem like a lot, it was a particularly relevant period for the renewable energy sector as it captures Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, some studies have shown that weather has a significant impact on the volatility of stocks, but until my thesis, there had been no investigation into whether this effect was also true for climate oscillations. The importance of this goes back to what I said on the previous slides, in that ENSO is periodic and one of the main drivers of weather. Therefore, uncovering a relationship between ENSO and the volatility of stocks offers more skill and power when forecasting than simply relying on weather alone. Thirdly, the literature is yet to determine whether it's merely a spurious relationship which exists between ENSO and renewable energy stocks. And so I added financial market controls to evaluate whether a significant relationship still exists, even after controlling for these confounding factors. And finally, there's no reason to expect that the effect of ENSO within the renewable energy market is homogeneous. And so I used subsector indices, which represented different areas of renewable energy, such as solar, wind, geothermal. And I use these in a novel way to evaluate whether the effect of ENSO is heterogeneous across these different subsectors. And so I know that's been quite a lot of information. So just to summarize, you can think of my thesis as focusing on 2 main questions. Number 1, how does ENSO influence both the volatility and returns of renewable energy stocks in the US and Europe? And number 2, does ENSO have heterogeneous impacts on subsectors of renewable energy? So in terms of data, there were several indices I used from different data sources to answer my questions. My independent variable was the May, and this is an index created by NOAA, which acts as a proxy for ENSO. Values of May above positive 0.5 represent El Nino events. Values of May below negative 0.5 represent La Nina events. The dependent variables include indices which represent the aggregate renewable energy stock market. So there's ERIX, which represents the market for Europe, whereas the ECO and the GNR reg represent the market for the US. There are also subsector indices which represent the different subsectors of renewable energy stocks, including wind, solar, geothermal, fuel cell energy, as well as the manufacturing sector of renewable energy power plants. Moving on to methodology, there are also three main empirical tools I deploy in my research. So firstly, we have OLS. There's still a debate within the literature over whether ENSO has a linear relationship with stocks. Therefore, I use OLS to test this for both the return and the volatility of renewable energy stocks. I also include empirical specifications which decompose my index for ENSO into El Nino and La Nina events in order to test the potential asymmetries within ENSO. Secondly, I have a logic model. This is because weather events are thought to have an asymmetric effect on the stock market, with some studies indicating that weather events are more impactful when the market is already in decline. This is why I use Logit, as it allows me to examine the probability the return of any particular renewable energy index is in the lower quartile, i.e. the bottom 25% of returns following an ENSO event. And then finally, the VAR model is used as a statistical tool to illustrate the effects of ENSO on renewable energy stocks over time. And I do this by using impulse response functions. This is crucial as it allows us to test whether the effects are only instantaneous or whether they're persistent. So my thesis involved a lot of different variations of analysis, and so I have a lot of results, but I'm going to attempt to summarize the main findings now. With regards to my OLS regressions, they found that although ENSO doesn't seem to have a linear effect on returns, it does have a significant linear effect on the volatility. Specifically, increases in La Nina increase the volatility of the aggregate renewable energy stock market for both the US and Europe. Increases in La Nina intensity also increase the volatility of four key subsectors, including wind, solar, geothermal energy, as well as the manufacturing sector of renewable energy power plants. My logic model finds that ENSO is also instrumental in affecting downside risk. Specifically, for the aggregate renewable market, the more intense La Nina is, the more likely the returns are in the lower quartile, which means the downside risk increases. This is also true for wind, geothermal, fuel cell energy, as well as for the manufacturing sector. However, a notable exception is that La Nina does not seem to affect the downside risk of solar energy stocks. Then finally, we have the VAR model, and that evaluates the longer-term impacts of ENSO. And it found that La Nina affects the aggregate renewable stock market in the US and Europe for over a year. However, what's interesting is that wind energy is the only subsector for which La Nina has similar long-lasting effects. The other subsectors seem to only be impacted immediately. So this slide just shows a snapshot of some of the impulse response functions which are in my thesis. For each graph, the response functions on the left represent El Nino, and the ones on the right represent La Nina. Like I said, you can see how a La Nina shock causes a spike in volatility, and then it fades out over a year. So within my thesis, I do offer some suggestions for why we might be seeing the exceptions we do, but it's definitely something that future research should look into further, especially into the heterogeneity of solar power. So to conclude, you might have realized that I mentioned La Nina a lot, and not really the effect of El Nino. This is because pretty much all of the tests I ran for El Nino events showed that the effects were insignificant, highlighting the asymmetric impact of ENSO on renewables. If I had to give two main takeaways from my research, it would be one, that La Nina is more influential on renewable energy stocks than El Nino, especially for volatility. And two, that the impacts of La Nina on renewable energy subsectors are relatively homogeneous, apart from the key exceptions I previously stated, such as solar power. So for implications, my results are important from both a financial and policy perspective. From the financial side, there's a growing interest by investors for products that allow them to hedge against the realizations of climate risk. By showing the power of La Nina, specifically in forecasting the volatility of renewable stocks, my research offers valuable insights to investors engaged with sustainability. From the policy perspective, governments are increasingly subsidizing renewables as part of their plans to decarbonize and transition to clean energy. Therefore, it's important to understand which subsectors are most susceptible to risk. My results suggest that fuel cell energy is the most robust against climate shocks, and so doesn't significantly impact its overall volatility. Therefore, findings like this can be used by policymakers to decide which subsectors to invest into. So that was a very quick overview of my thesis. I want to thank everyone in the economics department for all of their help. Also to the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies for giving me this opportunity to present on my research. Thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Georgia, and I just graduated from Princeton in the spring, and I'm happy to be sharing my thesis research with you all today. My work is titled, Does the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, Segregate? An analysis of the effects of privately provided low-income housing on neighborhood composition. And I attempt to determine how tax credit subsidized development affects the demographic characteristics and the income characteristics of the neighborhoods where these new or rehabilitated properties are placed in service for low-income residents. So just to start with a bit of background, housing policy in the United States has largely been organized around this concept of the public-private partnership, which means that a large number of housing affordability programs in the United States are orchestrated through private lenders or developers or mortgage banks that are provided with incentives from the federal government to make housing more affordable. But historically, private actors have also been governed by a separate set of market incentives that contributed to the consolidation of Black homeowners in blighted urban properties, and really created a pretty deeply entrenched system of housing segregation. So my thesis is exploring a more recent version of this public-private partnership, as I mentioned, called the LIHTC, which is a tax incentive that is granted to developers as long as a certain portion of the units within the new or rehabilitated project are designated to be rent restricted. And the LIHTC is fairly well studied in economics literature. For example, it's been shown to raise nearby home prices, but there's pretty limited empirical work establishing a causal connection between LIHTC development and demographic trends. So I've listed two studies on the slide. The first is that shows that LIHTC subsidized development spurs the in-migration of low earners, but it doesn't necessarily push out high earners. And a second study found that there was a significant increase in the minority concentration of a census tract as a result of the LIHTC in areas that already had a large pre-existing minority concentration. So generally speaking, literature investigating the LIHTC and its effects on racial characteristics is pretty limited in its geographic scope, and also there's limited empirical work parsing the causal relationship between the two. And that's kind of how I arrived upon my research question, which has three parts. One, how do LIHTC developments affect the demographic characteristics of the tracts in which they're built, and how does LIHTC development affect the poverty and income in neighborhoods in which they are built? And third, do these effects vary based on pre-existing neighborhood characteristics? And I want to investigate the impact of the LIHTC on demographic characteristics and income characteristics. And I get demographic data from the US Census from 2000 to 2012, and I use HUD data that includes a lot of great information on LIHTC subsidized properties and where they're located. And my descriptives were pretty intuitive. I found that tracts with LIHTC development have higher poverty rates, larger minority populations, which is pretty expected for low-income housing. And my outcome variables of interest in this study were things like change in the white population, change in the Black population, the change in median income, change in poverty rate, things like that. So I want to estimate the effect of LIHTC development on the change in these demographic and income variables over a 10-year period. And I won't go too much in depth into the actual mechanics of my thesis, but basically I can't use a simple linear model because there are many neighborhood related variables that affect developer choice, but are not included in the data set and are thus unobserved. So that will create some endogeneity issues and will not produce an unbiased estimator. So to circumvent this, I use a methodology formalized by Card et al. Called the regression kink. And it's very similar to regression discontinuity, except instead of estimating a treatment effect based on a discontinuous jump in the running variable around a certain cutoff, it gauges a treatment effect based on a change in the first derivative of the running variable around a certain threshold. So luckily for me, the tax credit includes an additional incentive for development in certain low income census tracts called QCTs, which are areas in which more than half of the residents are earning below 60% of the wider statistical area's median income. And those developers are granted an additional incentive. So as you can see, the administrative structure of the credit is creating a really nice discontinuity around this QCT cutoff. So when we look at the average number of LIHTC units and then the share of households that are meeting this cutoff, we're going to see a large kink around the QCT qualifying cutoff. And I've written the actual models on the slide, but intuitively what I'm doing is taking the change in the slope of the running variable around the cutoff and asking, is there also a change in slope around the cutoff for any of my outcome variables? And the model's basic assumption is that if there is a statistically significant treatment effect, we should see a corresponding large kink in the outcome variable around this QCT cutoff. And that is basically how the estimation will occur. So what I find is that LIHTC development produced a statistically significant treatment effect, and it caused a statistically significant increase in both the share and total white population in treated tracts. And I also find a statistically significant decrease in both the share and overall level of Hispanic residents in tracts receiving LIHTC construction. And so as you can see from the bin scatters, this is manifested by a clear slope change around the QCT cutoff. And I did think this was maybe counterintuitive result, because like, why would more low-income housing bring more white residents? So to help explain this result, I first restricted my sample to tracts with low and high minority presence, which are defined based on the ratio of the tract's minority population to the wider county's minority population. So tracts with high relative minority populations will be considered to have high minority presence. And I find that LIHTC development produced a statistically significant increase in the white population share and a decrease in the Hispanic share in areas that had a large pre-existing minority presence. Although there was no change in the Hispanic population, which suggests that the shift in Hispanic share is driven primarily by an influx of white residents rather than any sort of exodus of Hispanic residents. And then I next restrict the tracts based on whether they are gentrifying or declining, based on the change in median house price over time. And tracts with high house value growth are considered gentrifying, and tracts with low or negative house price growth are considered declining. And I find that in gentrifying areas, the LIHTC produced a 20.5% increase in the tract's white population, which was a larger treatment effect than the one I estimated when considering tracts overall. So this suggests that the influx of white residents seen in my initial result is driven at least in part by a large influx of white residents, specifically in gentrifying areas. And I also see a decline in the white population in declining tracts as a result of the LIHTC. So I wanted to also briefly touch on some of the methodological limitations of the study, because I was hoping to estimate the effects of the LIHTC on a tract's median income and poverty. I do find a statistically significant increase in the poverty rate. However, this is a tenuous finding when we look at the bin scatter. Sometimes with a regression kink, the model is impacted by underlying non-linear relationships between the assignment variable and the outcome variables. So as we can see here, this looks like a pretty much linear relationship that's like affected by one outlier. So this is essentially a case where a discontinuous change manifests as like a statistically significant slope change. So we can see that this is what's happening for poverty. And I ran a permutation test to check the robustness of my results. And I found that the demographic effects that I discussed were strong, but the estimated treatment effects on income were not. So ultimately, my results show that the LIHTC does not produce a statistically significant increase in attracts minority population, which is a promising result given that privately provided low-income housing has historically been shown to do so. I find a questionable impact on poverty, but past literature shows that the credit only had a small impact on neighborhood income. And critically, I find that areas that were already gentrifying see a larger increase in the number of white residents as a result of credit-assisted development. And this is most likely because development replaces pre-existing neighborhood disamenities, and this finding aligns with a lot of studies that show LIHTC development increases nearby property value. Perhaps the LIHTC is improving property values and bringing new white residents to the area because these new developments are replacing blight. And there's also the potential that the development is pricing out Hispanic residents, although I do not observe the income of the Hispanic residents that move away, so we can't tell with certainty that this is the case. But also importantly, I find that the effects of the LIHTC vary based on pre-existing neighborhood characteristics. So this implies that the policy needs to be applied with a cautious hand. And ultimately, I think these results provide an interesting policy question for lawmakers. If pre-existing low-income residents that aren't living in these rent-restricted units can no longer afford nearby properties, it's a troubling result. Given that the program's intent is to provide affordable housing. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the Griswold Center for allowing me to share my research.
Hello, my name is Suttasunthorn, and I wrote my senior thesis on the impact of migrant enclaves on labor market integration for refugees in Germany. I would first like to thank my advisor Linto for her guidance on this project, and thank you to Dana as well for your work with the Griswold Center. So the background behind this thesis is the 2015 European migrant crisis in Germany. German law protects the right to asylum, and during this time, Germany received a large influx of refugee migrants, and labor market integration remains a current issue. Migrant enclaves and co-ethnic networks have been found to be able to disseminate information about the job market and therefore have the potential to have a positive impact on immigrants' outcomes. A little bit of institutional background about Germany. Upon arrival, refugees or asylum seekers are subject to mandatory distribution quotas, which are calculated by the tax revenues and population amongst Germany's 16 states. With the recognition of refugee status, they have the ability to relocate and have full access to the labor market. These aspects could make it difficult to disentangle the effect of ethnic enclaves on labor market integration. Therefore, two research questions are posed in this thesis. First is whether past migration patterns predict the composition of current migrant enclaves. And second, whether those with asylum-seeking backgrounds benefit in labor market outcome from the existence of these enclaves. The literature review covers three broad areas. The first is labor market integration. There is a wide range of economic literature on the assimilation of immigrants in high-income countries. However, data on asylum-seeking population is lacking in longitudinal form. The second area is ethnic enclaves and migrant networks. It's well known that pre-existing migrant communities impact individuals' migration decisions, and this impacts migration patterns and systems. There are conflicting results in the migration literature pertaining to whether these enclaves benefit the labor market integration of migrants. However, The long-run potential for positive impact can be used as an argument against mandatory dispersal policies such as those in Germany. Lastly is the use of the Bartik instrument in migration literature, specifically in cases where there is no pure policy shock. This instrument exploits previous exogenous shares of foreigners in order to predict current migration, and this is a methodology that I use in this paper. The data that I use harmonizes two types of data, individual level data and regional level data. The individual level data comes from the German Socioeconomic Panel. This panel is a survey that's representative of the German population and has an enhanced sample for refugees. These data consist of labor market outcomes, including employment status, labor force status, and wage, as well as individual characteristics. I specifically focus on a subset of asylum seekers that come from non-European origin countries. The regional level data comes from the German Federal Statistical Office and Eurostat regional statistics. These data consist of total counts of foreign population by nationality, as well as other regional characteristics. Using Eurostat NUTS 2 classification, this divides Germany into 38 regions pertaining to the governmental districts or equivalent. The methodology that I use in this paper is an instrumental variable specification using the Bartik instrument following past migration literature. The main specification is essentially a linear probability model of employment in which the outcome variable is an individual indicator for labor market status, such as employment status, labor force status, or wage. This variable is regressed on a vector of individual level controls, as well as regional controls and region fixed effects. We include the independent variable of interest as a measure of either enclave density or enclave size. So that's either the concentration of co-nationals or the number of co-nationals in an individual's region. This independent variable is estimated in the first stage regression using the Bartik instrument as a predictor. The Bartik instrument essentially uses a proportion in a base year, in this case 2014, the year before the migration crisis. And it takes the number of foreigners of a specified nationality in one region of Germany as a fraction of those foreigners in all of Germany and multiplies it by the number of foreigners of that nationality in all of Germany in the current observation year in order to get a regional prediction based on the proportion in its base year. To summarize the methodology, we start with the Bartik instrument, which estimates the regional number of foreigners of a given nationality based on base year 2014 in order to predict the independent variable for enclave density or size. And we use this as a measure of the migrant enclave and look at its impact on the individual outcome variable for employment, labor force participation, or wage in the current year. The results of the first stage estimation is shown in the correlation plots to the right. These plots depict the relationship between enclave density and enclave size to each of their respective Bartik instruments. We see here that there is a clear, strong positive correlation between these variables, which suggests that the Bartik instrument is a good predictor of these independent variables. Empirically, we also find a first stage F statistics that are greater than the rule of thumb of 10, which is a strong argument for instrument relevance. Moving on to the main results, the first dependent variable of interest is employment. So what we see in this table is the linear probability model of employment outcome with all individual controls included. Each individual control yields statistically significant coefficients in their expected directions consistent with the standard model of employment. Just to note that from here on out, the tables are abbreviated without the individual variables. We look at the main specification, which is the instrumental variables regression with a full set of individual controls, and region fixed effects. And the main coefficient on enclave density is shown to be insignificant and negative. So this says that an increase in the concentration of an individual's co-nationals by 1 percentage point yields an insignificant negative impact. Because this is insignificant, there is possible no effect, and the upper bound of the confidence interval shows a very small value for any potential positive impact. Next, we use our alternative independent variable for enclave size instead of density and look at its effect on employment. In this case, we interpret the coefficient as an increase in enclave size or the number of co-nationals in an individual's region by 10,000 immigrants. In this case, we see that an increase in enclave size yields a significant negative impact on an individual's likelihood of employment. We also see that OLS overestimates the magnitude of impact as well as its significance level. Although these results might seem discouraging, there are a lot of plausible explanations in the literature. For example, it can be reasoned that large enclaves may decrease job finding rates in the short run, but this effect can become positive in the long run. And given the timeline of this analysis post-crisis, these results can be interpreted as short run. The second dependent variable of interest is labor force status. We see that for both enclave density and enclave size, all regressions yield insignificant coefficients, so there's potentially no effect of these independent variables on labor force participation. The last outcome variable of interest is wage, and this is what yielded the most striking results. For both enclave density and enclave size, we see a persistently negative significant effect across all regressions. There are a few possible explanations for this outcome. First is the absence of enclave quality in my regressions. In migration literature, enclave quality can often be used to explain returns to benefits and disadvantages of migrant networks. Secondly, it could be the case that larger enclave sizes and densities can discourage investment in human capital, causing individuals to settle for less paying jobs. Lastly is the sample size. Because such a small fraction of the sample is employed, there are very little individuals earning non-zero wage. Especially using non-European asylum origin countries as a restricted sample, there is not quite a well-established migrant network or communities in the host country yet. So to summarize, there is very little significant evidence for the impact of migrant enclaves on employment and labor force participation for the sample, other than the effect of enclave size on employment. The interesting result was the significant negative effect on wage, and these IV results are robust to varying levels of controls and fixed effects, as well as to an alternative region classification. The policy analysis for this thesis focuses on two main areas. The first is the question of mandatory distribution quotas. I reason that the adverse effect is not quite ruled out by the employment effect, particularly because of the explanations of these negative effects being in the short run. Second is the potential that enclave quality may impact the returns to migrant enclaves. Improving the enclave quality, for example, through job search assistance, language courses, or integration assistance, may help us to see more positive effects in employment and labor force participation. A few areas for further research. First is the period analysis. These results display short-run effects only, considering that the timeline after the refugee crisis is rather short, and often these effects are found to be negative, but there is potential for long-run positive effects. The second is further research into enclave quality. This may provide an explanation for the returns to advantages and disadvantages to enclave size and density that we saw in these regressions. Lastly is a sample. The main contribution that this thesis brings to the literature is the motivation for a focus on non-European asylum origin countries and immigrant groups that have larger barriers to integration in their host countries. Additional analysis allowing for heterogeneity could be useful in order to further specify the effects on different nationality groups as well. Thank you for watching.
Hi everyone, my name is Wang, and today I will be presenting my senior thesis titled The Effects of the Removal of the Exclusion of Biosimilars from Medicare's Coverage Gap Discount Program. I know that's a long title, but essentially I'm looking at a law change that allows biosimilars to participate in Medicare's Coverage Gap Discount Program, which they couldn't do before, and evaluating the effects of that. I'd like to thank my professor, Professor Kate Ho, for all of her support and guidance throughout the year. Okay, so quick background. So biosimilars are intricately tied to biologics, which are complex life-saving drugs that cost a lot of money to make. And biosimilars can be thought of as the generic versions of these reference biologics. The picture on the right kind of gives you a brief comparison of what a biologic is compared to a traditional small molecule drug that, like an ibuprofen that maybe someone would be taking. If a traditional drug were to be a bicycle, a biologic would be a complex fighter jet. That's how, big the difference is in the scale. So biologics account for roughly 40% of US's annual $350 billion spent on prescription drugs, but only fewer than 2% of Americans use them, showing you how expensive they really are. In 2019, Humira, the highest selling biologic, made sales of $20 billion. And for the US, we want to reduce healthcare spending. And one way to do that is to try to reduce the cost of these biologics. And how do we do that? We introduce competition or generic versions of these called biosimilars. We know that the FDA has said that generics for traditional drugs have saved the US well over $1 trillion in the last decade. And so to try to do this for biologics, in 2010, as a part of the Affordable Care Act, this approved pathway for biosimilars to get approved was enacted into law. So although this has been happening since 2010, biosimilar uptake in the US is still pretty slow and faces many barriers. Some of the reasons for this is because, one, biosimilars are still pretty expensive, and patients may still prefer to use the trusted biologics or the reference biologic that has been working for them instead. Another reason why biosimilars have low uptake is because some patients and physicians don't have as much trust with biosimilars. And also, biosimilars can't just simply be substituted for biologics, unlike generics. Finally, what I'm looking at in this paper is the lack of inclusion of biosimilars within insurance formulary designs. And specifically, I'm looking at Medicare Part D. So this is saying that if you're a patient and your insurance company isn't covering a biosimilar, but is covering a biologic, you're more likely to simply use the biologic because the insurance plan is probably giving you a discount for it. So within Medicare, which is the federal health insurance for those 65 and above, Part D covers prescription drugs. And as you probably know with insurance, there's the deductible, initial coverage, the coverage gap, and until once you reach a certain amount of money, then the catastrophic coverage kicks in. And because federal insurance is extremely expensive, in order to try to save costs, there's this thing called the coverage gap, wherein patients are responsible for all of the costs for their drugs. But to try to save patients some money, there was this thing called the coverage gap discount program that was invented, which requires and allows biologics and brand name drugs to provide a 50% rebate to Medicare. However, when this law was created, biosimilars were excluded. So you can imagine, if a biologic can give an insurance company a 50% discount, that essentially could make the biologic cheaper than the biosimilar, incentivizing these insurance plans to cover the biologics instead of the biosimilar. In 2018, there was a new law starting in 2019 that takes place starting in 2019 that now allow for biosimilars to provide the same percentage of rebates as the biologic, evening out the playing field. There was a study that estimates that this law change could save the US $1 billion in the next decade. So here's a brief kind of overview of what that insurance plan and cost file looked like for patients before the law change here and after the law change. So prior to the law change, the plan was able to get a 50% manufacturer rebate for brand name drugs and biologics, which allowed beneficiaries to pay for only 35% of the cost of the biologic. Whereas for generics and biosimilars, the beneficiary would have to pay 44%, and the Medicare plan itself would have to pay 56% compared to the 15%. So there would be very little incentive for them to want to cover biosimilars. However, in 2022, in 2019, after the law change, we see that the manufacturer rebates has actually also gone up to 70%. And now, as biosimilars are also able to participate, patients only have to pay 25% for both biologics and biosimilars, and the plan only has to pay 5%, making it so that there is much more incentive to cover the cheaper biosimilar drugs. So the motivation of this paper is that this paper is the first to analyze the effects of this policy change. And it's also a very exciting time for biosimilars because major biologics such as Humira and Enbrel, their biosimilars are entering the market as of this year in 2023. I obtained my data from the Center of Medicare Services Medicare Part D plan formulary cost files, quarterly files, all the way from 2016 to 2021. And I also use Micromedics' historical pricing files from the Red Book, which allows me to look at how the costs have changed over time. Because I needed drugs that had biologics that had biosimilars before the law change, I end up with three reference biologic class groups, which is filgrastim, pegfilgrastim, and epinephrine. Some of these drugs are drugs that treat or help patients who have experienced post chemotherapy treatment. So here's a brief overview of kind of an general view of some of the coverage results. And by coverage, I mean the percentage of plans that are covering the drugs. We can see that for all the biologics, this one, and this one, their coverage goes down after the red line, which is when the policy is enacted. And so after biosimilars are able to participate, we see that the coverage for these reference biologics go down, while for their respective biosimilars, the coverage goes up, which is very promising. In addition to simply coverage, I'm also looking at other beneficiary benefit design tools, such as where the drug is placed, which tier the drug is placed on. I'm also looking at step therapy, which require patients to first try a less expensive drug before they go on that drug, and then prior authorization, which means the patients must show the plan that they meet certain criteria to obtain the coverage for the drugs. So in 2016, we see that for the reference biologic, it had around 96% coverage, significantly decreased by 2021. The tier seems to go up. There's requirements for average step therapy now. Prior authorization goes down, perhaps mainly because patients are more familiar and insurance plans are more familiar with the drug, but the cost is also seems to be increasing as well. So in order to actually obtain what the impact of the law change specifically was, I use the difference in difference model, and I use two separate models to look at for reference biologics and their biosimilars. And for the reference biologics, I use a control group of the top selling biologics with no biosimilar competition. So that serves as a good control group to look at the difference. And for biosimilars, I actually look at three different control groups. The best one I use is the top selling generic drugs. This is because generics can still to this day not provide the 50% manufacturer rebate. So we actually see the impact directly for the biosimilar, and we can compare with the control group that the law doesn't impact. And the pre-trend figure shows that these are all good control groups that I was able to use. So the policy change my results show that the policy change had significant impacts on the reference biologics coverage and the tier placement. So this treat times post variable in bold is the variable of interest. The biggest finding is that reference biologics experience a roughly 20% percentage point decrease in coverage compared to the control biologics after the policy change. And the average coverage prior to the policy change was around 64%. So that's a 20% percentage point decrease, which is a big impact. We also see that the tier placement for these reference biologics are increasing, and we see no significant impact for prior authorization, step therapy, or out-of-pocket costs. It's interesting that the out-of-pocket cost is kind of decreasing, but my hypothesis for that is that as biosimilar competition is coming in, these biologic drugs may be decreasing their prices to remain competitive. For biosimilar coverage, we find that the policy change also has a significant impact on the coverage, prior authorization, and step therapy. So the coverage of biosimilars also increased by roughly an average of 20 percentage points compared to the control group, and average coverage of biosimilars before the policy change was 50%. So the law change essentially provided that additional boost of 19.81 percentage points. We see that as biosimilars are going up too, we have increases in prior authorization and a decrease in step therapy, which is a good sign, positive sign for beneficiary coverage. So overall, in terms of policy implications, my paper finds that this policy change is associated with a positive impact on biosimilar coverage and negative impact on reference biologic coverage in Medicare Part D plans. I think this is really interesting because it leads to future research that could explore whether the increased coverage of biosimilar does in fact lead to higher prescriptions and uptake of biosimilars over these reference biologics. And if research finds that it doesn't, then there may be a deeper root cause, as some of the examples I foreshadowed earlier of maybe patients and physicians not trusting these drugs as much. I believe future research could also evaluate the impact of this policy change on absolute rebates and whether reference biologic companies participate in things called bundled rebates. So what these are is that these biologic companies with the reference biologics may own other types of drugs, and they can convince insurance plans perhaps to cover all of their drugs by providing them a bundled rebate, so rebates on multiple drugs as well. Another thing called the absolute rebates is whether or not these biologic companies, because their prices are so high, that 50 or 70% rebate in absolute terms might be way bigger than what the biosimilar is offering based on their prices. So that's another thing that could be looked at in the future. Overall, this paper, I think, is a first step in kind of getting a better understanding into this niche field of how we can increase biosimilar uptake. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and please reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.